So I'm Sam Taylor. I'm the Assistant Director of the Startup Law Clinic at BU School of Law. And joining me today is Daryl Walton, one of the other directors of the clinic. We are two of the three directors. And the BU Startup Law Clinic is one of two free legal service clinics that is part of a partnership with MIT. We provide free legal services to students at MIT and BU. So if you're a student at MIT or BU and you either have, startup type questions or technology type, legal questions, or you have a venture that you're a founder of, or otherwise you're one of the leaders of, you're welcome to apply for our services. And we provide a whole host of services from, entity formation to IP ownership advice and actual registration, contract drafting, regulatory compliance advice, things like that. So again, we'll provide you a link to our website at the end so you can learn more about our services. But today we're talking about nonprofit basics. I'll let Daryl get us started. And again, if you have any questions, shoot them in the chat and we'll answer them as soon as we can.
Awesome. Thanks, Sam, and thanks, everyone. We're glad you could join us today. So Sam, if you want to click to the first slide, we'll get started. So the first thing to state is, before we dive into talking about nonprofit organizations and in great specifics, I think it's important to take a moment to consider what the objective most people have when approaching nonprofits is. So most people are generally drawn to nonprofit organizations because they associate the word nonprofit with doing something charitable, or they're trying to achieve some social good, or profit generation. So making money isn't their primary objective. It's important to note that you can actually achieve those benefits, right? You can do something charitable, or you can achieve a social good, in more than just in multiple business forms, right? So this first slide really highlights that there's more than just nonprofit options, right? So there's more than a nonprofit corporation as an option if you're trying to achieve social good. So if you're trying to do a social initiative, social initiatives can actually be accomplished through a variety of entities. So the one I think most people are familiar with, again, is the nonprofit corporation. And that's most people think of a traditional charity, but there's also a benefit corporation. So a benefit corporation is a relatively new type of business entity, and in the business corporation, a benefit corporation is a hybrid entity. So most people prefer this entity because it allows them to pursue a for-profit mission, so make money, while also highly prioritizing a nonprofit or social benefit. So the way that this would work in a benefit corporation is that in your governing documents, you would specify both a general benefit and one or more specific benefits that would be in your bylaws, in your governing documents, and essentially be at the cornerstone of what your business is hoping to do. So that's a new exciting opportunity. But even if you're just thinking about, can good be done in a pure for-profit, it can be, and that can be done in an LLC or limited liability company. Limited liability companies are very flexible entities. So really what governs them is based on the contract among the owners or members of the limited liability company. So the owners of that company could state, one of our main goals is to do this social good, and that would just be part of the operating agreement, essentially the ownership arrangement of a limited liability company. You could also achieve a social initiative or do social good or charitable good through a C Corp or a corporation. Many people think that corporations have to operate purely for profit, but really what they're operating is for shareholder maximization. So maximizing shareholder value, and value can extend at least some degree beyond profit generation into other things that the shareholders might as a body agree to. So it's important to just remember generally that you're not just limited to one entity type, and that your approach, your mission, your operations might land you outside of the traditional nonprofit entity. And we can talk about that more later, but we just want to kind of just prime your mind to think a little bit broader as we begin to dive in. So with that, Sammy, can you take us to the next slide? So I know I just said all that, right? I just, gave you 4 different entity types. but you're here today to talk about nonprofits. So let's talk about nonprofits. So that first question that I think has to be asked is, well, what is a nonprofit? Well, the simple answer is, kind of hinted at it in the last slide, is that a nonprofit is a business entity, and it's a business entity that's governed by state law, just like any for-profit corporation or limited liability company. So I note that because I think that what happens is that we tend to conflate two key elements. One is the entity, and one is the tax status, into one piece. And I'll get into that further in a couple slides. But I just want you to start off now thinking the nonprofit is the type of entity that I have. So if you're forming a nonprofit in Massachusetts, you'll be forming what's called a nonprofit corporation. So it's a specific type of entity. So it's not a nonprofit limited liability company, it's a nonprofit corporation. And so what you would have to understand is, well, what are the characteristics of this nonprofit? So under Massachusetts law in the general legislature, chapter 180, section 4, it says that a nonprofit is a corporation, may be formed for any one or more of the following purposes. So it's a purpose-driven entity, and these purposes include, potentially being civic, educational, charitable, benevolent, or religious purpose, for the prosecution of any antiquarian, historical, literary, scientific, medical, chiropractic, artistic, monumental, or musical purpose, for establishing and maintaining libraries, for supporting any missionary enterprise having for its object the dissemination of religious and educational instruction in foreign countries. So as you can think, there's a lot of things that would fall into this, under a potential nonprofit purpose. But a couple other key characteristics that you want to pay attention to is that as a nonprofit corporation, it is a non-stock corporation, which means that there are no owners. So this is a key principle, because a lot of people will say, well, I own a nonprofit or my nonprofit, but really the nonprofit, because of its purpose of trying to advance a social or charitable good, is not seen as having owners, because for owners, we'd worry about the invasion of a private benefit. So you might start a nonprofit, but there's no ownership of that nonprofit. That ownership is really viewed largely as being owned by the public, and you're essentially operating the nonprofit for that public benefit. So to that point, as a nonprofit, like the assets that would be provided to that nonprofit, become the nonprofit's assets and are dedicated to advancing the nonprofit or charitable purpose. And that becomes important because once assets become associated with a nonprofit, it then becomes harder to bring them out of the nonprofit and back into the private space. The next thing, again, I kind of hinted at it, is that nonprofits are meant not to benefit private individuals. Again, they're meant to be a tool for groups or for the general public at large. So actions that connect or try to advance the private interest of a limited number of people or key stakeholders would run against what the purpose of a nonprofit would be. And then the next 2 points move out of our thinking of nonprofits as entities and into our thinking of nonprofits as in their tax status. So nonprofits, most nonprofits are not automatically tax exempt. There are a few, like churches, that automatically have tax exempt status, but most nonprofits have to apply for tax exempt status both at the state and federal level. And then the extent of tax exemption is not the same for all nonprofits, and we'll get into that with the next slide. Sam, do you want to hit us with the next slide? So in this slide, we're talking about the second part of a nonprofit. So we talked about the entity. The next piece we want to talk about is its tax exempt status. So most people are enticed or encouraged to form nonprofits because they know that a nonprofit can be tax exempt. Well, what does tax exemption mean? It says that tax exempt status exempts a nonprofit from paying corporate income tax on income generated from activities that are substantially related to the purposes for which the group was organized. So what that means is that the nonprofit doesn't have to pay certain taxes, and those taxes are certain types of taxes, but then it's taxes on items that are related to its activities. So it's exempt activities. So If a nonprofit engages or a tax-exempt entity engages in activities that are not associated with its purpose, it could still be required to pay taxes for revenues gained from those activities. As I said before, nonprofits are not automatically exempt. They have to file at the federal level with the IRS, and they may have to, and they likely have to file at the state level. So with us, it'd be Massachusetts. And then finally, it's important to note that when we think of nonprofits and we think about tax-exempt entities, it's important to also note that when we commonly think of tax exemption, we think of what is 501c3 organizations. But the 501c3 is a subsection of the IRS code, and it only refers to one type of tax-exempt organization. There's actually somewhere around 29 different classifications, both within 501c and other parts of the tax code for exempt organizations. Some popular, subclasses include C4, which is your civic leagues or organizations that do lobbying. 501c3s are prohibited from engaging in political activity and can only lobby, only can have insignificant lobbying. The C6 is your business leagues or chambers of commerce. Your C7 is your social and recreational clubs. So like your Elks Club, your fraternities, sororities are in that. And I misspoke, your Elks Club is actually a C8, a fraternal organization. But there's a number of other organizations, classifications that your organization might fit into. So it's just important to kind of step back and understand what it means to be a nonprofit and where your specific organization might fit into the entire, into the larger landscape. For most of you, you will largely fit into the 501c3, which is the public charity or private foundation. And we'll get into that a little bit more later, but we just wanted to tease and break out these elements before we get into what Sam will talk about next, which is the life cycle of the nonprofit, and then how do you actually form a nonprofit.
Thanks, Daryl. Okay, so the rest of this conversation, this presentation, we'll really be focusing on the life cycle of a Massachusetts nonprofit. So when we say the life cycle, we're going to talk about the formation and then some aspects of the actual governance of it. And then, this does end up being relevant to some of our clients, the dissolution of a nonprofit. So let's start with formation first. So one thing to keep in mind is that you may have heard that with a for-profit corporation, people, or even LLC, limited liability company, people frequently form their company in Delaware. That is not a standard thing for nonprofits. With for-profit companies, they form in Delaware a lot because investors like that. So and they have a very highly developed corporate law. But with a nonprofit, usually it's formed in the state where the key operations are. So for our clients based here in Massachusetts, we're usually forming Massachusetts nonprofits. And so we're going to go through a few different things here, including actual formation of the entity, filing with the IRS for tax exempt status, and also registering with the Massachusetts Attorney General's office. And we'll explain the process for all of that. And then for governance, we'll talk about maintenance of the registration and staying alive as an entity, some key things about employment, and then again we'll get to dissolution. So so forming the nonprofit, it's actually pretty simple to form the nonprofit, to get it going. You file what's called, in Massachusetts, the Articles of Organization. It's a relatively straightforward document. You say the name of the nonprofit, the purpose, where it's based in Massachusetts, its fiscal year end, and then you identify the officers and directors. Once you've got that all in there, it can be a bit of a longer document, but really it's just kind of setting up the basic information about the nonprofit. And we've got a link here. And again, this presentation will be available on our website shortly. We've got a link here that you can go to get right to the form you need to fill out in Massachusetts to submit the Articles of Organization. So as I mentioned, in the Articles of Organization, you're going to need to identify the directors of your nonprofit. So who are the directors? So you've got a board of directors, and they're responsible for the strategy and oversight of the nonprofit. So not necessarily the day-to-day operations of the nonprofit, but they're the ones that are figuring out, the long-term goals and direction of the nonprofit. And directors of nonprofits, they have certain legal obligations called fiduciary duties. And we've identified the two key ones here: duty of loyalty and duty of care. And really what these mean is, loyalty, you're not going to make decisions for the nonprofit that are, not in its best interests, or you're not going to make decisions that are better for some other entity, in place of your own, so loyalty to the nonprofit that you're a director for. And care, meaning, you take the due diligence and you put in the care to really, truly care for the nonprofit. So these are standard fiduciary duties. And I think the point we want to make here is that if you do agree to be a director of a nonprofit, you should understand that there's real responsibility that comes with that, not just from a social standpoint and cultural standpoint, but from a legal one too. So don't take that question lightly. So the board of directors, they meet regularly to provide, as I mentioned, oversight with strategy, long-term strategy. And, what does regularly meet? I think that probably depends on your nonprofit and how often it really requires the meeting of the directors to talk about strategy. So that might be monthly or quarterly, maybe more, maybe a bit less, but probably at least monthly or quarterly, just to make sure the board is regularly up to date on what's happening with the nonprofit. In Massachusetts, there must be at least 3 directors, unless there are fewer people in the nonprofit. So if, like, sometimes, there might be one person that forms a nonprofit, and at that moment, it's okay to have 1 director. But once you get over 3 people who are involved in the nonprofit, you need at least 3 directors. And this is in part because you are legally required for the board of directors to essentially avoid conflicts of interest. So at least half of the board cannot be related by blood or through, have a connection through business relationship or be a paid employee. You have to have people that are, the point here is you have to have people on the board that have some level of distance from what's really happening in the nonprofit, so that they can make a measured decision whenever they're asked to do so, and they can live up to their duties of loyalty and care. So it's important for a nonprofit to make sure the directors can properly do their job. And a key reason for this is because we all know nonprofits, we assume that they're doing good, right? And we want to donate money to them, and we want to trust them that what they're doing is making the world a better place. So as part of that, the state expects the board of directors to be able to make decisions that push those goals. So that's why it's so important to avoid conflicts of interest in the board of directors. And so in terms of the talent sets that you need, I think, thinking about these bullets I've just gone over, that can kind of help you think about the talent sets that you might need. Someone who maybe has experience previously running a nonprofit, or at least being involved with one. Someone who really cares about the goals of the nonprofit and understands the role of a nonprofit, right? Like they're, not just trying to make a buck, you're actually trying to advance some sort of charitable purpose. And, maybe someone who's good with operations and understands, from a strategic standpoint, the best way to run a company. So, the point here is that you should really not think about the director's situation lightly. It's something that's very important to the management of your company. And just to talk a bit more about the formation of the company. So you've got the articles of organization that actually form the company and identifies your directors. But once you've done that, you're not done. There's a lot to do after that, but at least you kind of have the skeleton of the nonprofit created. So then you have what we call post-formation documents, and they kind of fill in the blanks. So for example, the bylaws are kind of like the rules for how the nonprofit can be run. So you may have rules in there about voting requirements. So like, a majority of the board must vote on something for it to pass. How often the board might meet, how many people should be on the board, roles of the different officers in the nonprofit. So, like what the executive director might do, things like that. So the bylaws are very important. And there's a series of consents, which are basically, we usually put them in writing, basically written documents identifying decisions that the board has made initially, about that they can open up a bank account, things like that. So there's some initial decisions that need to be made. Appointing again, like the executive director, that it's good to have in these initial documents. So if you just form the company, you're missing out on all these things. So it's important to do them. And if you come to the clinic, we can help you work through all these documents, so you won't be out there on your own. We'll help you through the formation and all of these post-formation documents. So you can think of today as just kind of a high-level introduction to this. So don't worry about completely understanding exactly what all these documents do. And the last bullet here, policies to minimize risk of abuse and ensure that you're staying within the non-exempt or you're staying within exempt activities. We have a series of documents like a conflict of interest and policy acknowledgement, which means anyone who's a director or high-level staff, we expect them to sign a document saying they understand what a conflict of interest is and they don't have one. And it's a regular thing that everyone is expected to sign. Again, because we're trying to be sure that the nonprofit is operating properly within its charitable purpose. There's a few other policies we list here. And again, the point is they're all about making sure that the nonprofit is operating within its charitable bounds and not taking advantage of people or of the cause. And again, if you come to the clinic, we can tell you a bit more about all of them. Back to Daryl, I believe.
Awesome. Thanks, Sam. So, we've now gone through a process where you've formed the nonprofit, right? So you have the entity. So again, what would be next is securing that tax exempt status. So, one of the most popular subchapters of, for securing or applying for and securing tax exempt status is 501c3. So again, this is just one of the many options, but it's one of the more popular options because of a couple reasons. One being that in addition to the organization being tax exempt, so not having to pay corporate tax, the donors or individuals and corporations and entities that donate to the organization also receive tax deductibility benefits from this. So, they receive different amounts. So for a public charity, they can receive up to 50% of a tax deductibility for income for public charities, and 30% for their annual income is tax deductible when donating to a private foundation. But let's take a step back and let's think more. Let's discuss, well, what are these different options when we say public charity, private foundation, and private operating foundation? So within 501c3, there's these different options, and they're based on what the organization ultimately will do. So with a public charity, as this name kind of sounds, it's designed to directly benefit the public. So it's doing a public good. So this is, you can think of like United Way, and you can think of Goodwill, right? They are directly benefiting the public. Their activities are, are restricted to public, charitable purpose. They have active programs of fundraising, and they raise contributions from many sources. Hence, it's public, right? The public is giving into the charity, and then the charity is doing a public good. And it can't be closely held, right? So in that regard, again, it's not just a small subset making decisions or governing. And I'm not talking about the board, but just like, if it was a small number of funders, then the funders would have an exorbitant amount of control that might be worrisome for the benefits that we allow public charities to have. So you might have alternatively, a small number of funders, right? So we think about like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundations or some of these larger foundations, like the Walton Family Foundation. They're designed for the purpose of financially supporting other public charities. So these are organizations that get a huge influx of money, and then they are not necessarily doing work themselves, but they are essentially making grants to other organizations. So they might make grants to, Habitat for Humanity to build homes, or to another charitable function. But itself, they are not, actually doing that. So public-private foundations, they can receive donations from a limited number of sources, like a family, right? And they can be closely held, but they face other restrictions. One of the restrictions is like they actually have, they're actually required to spend 5% of their, their assets each year, as a way to ensure that, they're not just sitting on money. So there's restrictions, and other requirements if you want to be a private foundation, but, it does allow for, different functionality away from the public charity. And then finally, you have the private operating foundation, which operates directly, operates programs directly benefiting the public. So again, it's kind of a mixture of the two. So it can be closely held and it can have funding from limited sources, but it is doing more of that direct, direct benefit to the public. Again, one key thing about public charities is that they must not obtain more than 1/3 of their funding from or they're supposed to obtain at least 1/3 of their funding from the public. So it must come from multiple sources. There's different tests to determine whether or not you're receiving the adequate amount of public funding. But just note that you want to make sure that you're not getting too much of your funds from one source. Otherwise, it could jeopardize your public charity status. Next slide, Sam. So you made the decision, okay, I want to apply to be a 501c3 or public charity, most likely. What do I have to do next? So you file with the Internal Revenue Service, so the IRS. Before you file with the IRS, you need to get an EIN or an employer identification number, which essentially is an entity's equivalent to a social security number. So you should file to receive that. So with the EIN, it's important to note there's two ways to file this. You can file a paper application and you can file online, but you do not want to file the paper application because the turnaround time on that, is kind of crazy. I don't even want to start to put a date on it because I've seen it go way longer than you'd even believe to, think to do it. So what you want to do is, grab this presentation after the fact, and then click the link, start to begin the application. And it's going to be important that you finish the application all at once and that you continue to kind of stay active. So AKA keep moving your mouse. Otherwise, you'll get automatically logged out. But you want to begin and complete this application, and then you'll get, pretty immediately a notice with your EIN, so that you'll have that, and then you can do things like open your bank account and then begin the process for filing your application for recognition of tax exemption, which is the form 1023 or 1023EZ, which is the federal form with the IRS. So on this slide, we see that there's the two forms. I gave out these weird designations, form 1023 and form 1023EZ. Well, what are these? It's just a simple application, and it's just two variants. So for the longest time, there was only one application, and it was the form 1023, and it's a long form. So, by itself, it is a 10-page document, and that doesn't include any of the schedules that you might have to fill out if you fall into other certain categories, or if certain activities that you do require additional information. And what the IRS was finding is that this was taking on average 9 hours for people to complete. So that's a long time. And then it was then on the turnaround time causing the IRS to take, potentially up to a year or more to approve these statuses. So what the IRS did in 2014 is they identified that, there are a lot of, organizations that we don't need all this upfront review. So what we can do is create this short form, which is 3 pages, and then which is the EZ form, and then we can kind of check for information later on. So the EZ form is simpler, but there are eligibility requirements. And Sam, on the next slide, I think we can talk about those. So the biggest eligibility requirements come from numbers 1, 2, and 3. So do you project that the annual gross receipts will exceed 50,000 years in any of the next 3 years? So are you bringing in more than $50,000? And when they say gross receipts, they mean everything. So any type of revenue. Do you reasonably, and reasonably is a key word, project that you will be receiving more than that? So not wishful thinking, but do you have a reasonable expectation that you have those funding sources secured? 2, have your gross receipts exceeded that $50,000 in any of the past 3 years? So do you have evidence that you've already crossed that threshold? So if not, then those are good signs. And then the third one is, do you have total assets in fair market value in excess of $250,000? So if you are going to be on the lower side of all 3 of these, then you can file the short form, which is going to save you a lot of headache up front. The IRS will check to make sure that you are an appropriate nonprofit, especially with the financial piece, which is the key difference between the short form and the long form, or one of the key differences. And they will check you later on your form 990, which is the tax form. So again, highlighting some of the differences. The Form 1023, the long form is complex, whereas the short form is simple. The long form will take longer. We have up to 6 months here, but due to some limitations in the IRS regarding staffing, it's taking even longer than that to process. So you have a quicker turnaround. You have the more compliance up front with the long form versus the IRS checking compliance later on through your filing of your annual information tax return. There's with the full form 1023, there's no donation issues, but with the EZ, certain foundations have policies stating that they will not accept grant applications if the company use the 1023 EZ. So there's some practical considerations, and then it's important on the long form to work with an accountant up front, and that's largely because the long form is going to ask you for extensive projections on your on the full form 1023. So you'll want to make sure that you have those correct and that you've talked to someone and that the numbers look all right. One of the biggest things that you'll want to watch out for is, does the director level compensation look like that's the primary benefit financially? So there's things like that that a nonprofit accountant can help with, and so can nonprofit attorneys. And then finally, we just want to point you to some resources. So 2 key resources. One, if you're located in Massachusetts, is the Massachusetts Society of CPAs. So I talked about getting a nonprofit accountant. This organization can help you secure a nonprofit accountant, and so can the Massachusetts Network for Nonprofit Network. So just thinking about this, these are additional resources that will help explain and walk through the document, because the questions may not always be the clearest. So it's always good to have additional help beforehand, rather than having to face questions later from the IRS. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Sam, who will talk about state level considerations and registration.
Thanks, Daryl. So we are still in the process of officially, registering and setting up the nonprofit. So we've just walked through actually forming the nonprofit, and with Daryl, we walked through at least the basics of the process of filing the 1023 with the IRS in order to get probably 501c3 status for most of our clients. So back within Massachusetts specifically, there's still another registration that's required, and that's registering the nonprofit with the Massachusetts Attorney General. And the link here will take you to the site where you can do that. So just to kind of give you a bit more context here, when you actually form the nonprofit, what you do is you submit those articles of organization that we talked about earlier. You submit those to the Secretary of the Commonwealth. So that in most states, it's called the Secretary of State, but in Massachusetts, since we're a Commonwealth, it's called Secretary of Commonwealth. And that's kind of the institution within the Massachusetts government where you're always going to be forming a company. Same if it's a for-profit company or a nonprofit. The Attorney General's office, the Attorney General is the head attorney for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And so you may be wondering, well, why are we registering with the head law enforcement person in the state? And that's because if you form a nonprofit, as we've mentioned kind of throughout this presentation, you're expecting the community to put a lot of trust in you. You may be soliciting donations. People expect that you're doing, you're advancing your charitable purpose. And so you can imagine there's ways for nonprofits to potentially take advantage of this situation and take advantage of people through a alleged charitable purpose. So the Attorney General is saying, okay, please register with my office if you want to have your nonprofit operating here. And so that's why, in addition to forming through the Secretary of the Commonwealth, you are also registering with the Attorney General's office. And what we've got here is a list of the documents you need to send to the Attorney General to formally register. So they have a registration form, and then you send them, your articles of organization, a list of the officers and directors, a copy of your bylaws. If you have already applied for your 501c status with the IRS, you include a letter for that to show that. But if you have not applied yet, you can still register with the Attorney General's office. They will still at some point want to see confirmation that you've applied. And at the bottom here, it says if you will be soliciting funds, which means soliciting donations, from residents of Massachusetts, then you need to fill out an additional document, which most nonprofits are doing. That's a lot of a big source of revenue to operate for nonprofits comes from donations. So as Daryl mentioned earlier, only organizations that are actually recognized as 501c3 by the IRS may solicit deductible donations from donors, right? So a donor, if they make a donation, they can deduct that donation from their own tax burden. And so that's a great benefit of being a 501c3, is that you can encourage donors by saying, hey, if you donate to our nonprofit, you can deduct this from your own taxable income. But before you actually do solicit donations from residents of Massachusetts, or residents of any state for that matter, you first need to comply with the relevant laws of that state that governs solicitation. So in Massachusetts specifically, if you want to solicit donations from residents in Massachusetts, you first need to obtain a certificate of solicitation from Massachusetts. And I'm just going to go back to this list of things you need to do to register with the Attorney General's office. And again, at number 7 at the bottom, it says if you'll be soliciting funds, and they mean seeking donations, you need to fill out a particular, they call it Schedule A2. And that's by filling out that document, you're asking for a certificate of solicitation, basically saying, I would like the right for my nonprofit to solicit donations from residents of Massachusetts. And it's not a huge burden to fill that out, but it is something you need to do. And in some states, there's actually a bit of a higher burden. You actually have to show, an example of the letter you would send to potential donors and things like that. But in Massachusetts, your key obligation is to submit the document to request a certificate of solicitation. Now, as you can imagine, if every single state in the country has some sort of registration obligation before you can solicit donations, that can be pretty burdensome. That there's 50 different states and there's territories. But a lot of states have some sort of kind of threshold requirement for you to actually need to submit, request a certificate of solicitation. So in Massachusetts, it's no different. So in Massachusetts, you don't actually have to get that certificate if all the following are met. Okay, so not just one of them, but all of them. And this applies to some of our clients. So if you expect to make less than $5,000 in the calendar year, and that money is going to come from less than 11 donors, so 10 or less, and you're not hiring any professional solicitor, you're not paying someone to help you get donations, and the key stakeholders within the nonprofit aren't receiving any payments, so no one's getting any salaries or anything like that if they are the key stakeholders. If all 4 of those things are met, then you do not have to apply for the certificate of solicitation in Massachusetts. And this can be relevant because there's some nonprofits as they're starting out, maybe in the first couple of years, they're not getting much money in from donors. They have a few donors and maybe they get $500 here, $500 there, and that money is huge. It's really helpful, but it just doesn't quite doesn't hit the $5,000 mark, and that's all that you need in that first year or two to operate. That's great. You don't need a certificate of solicitation from Massachusetts, but at any point, if you do all of a sudden have 11 or more donors, or you do hit that $5,000 mark, then you do at that point need to get the certificate of solicitation before you can do any solicitation, any further solicitation. Okay, so now you are fully formed. You've gone through all those documents. You've gotten your 501c3 status from the IRS. You've registered with the Attorney General's office. There's some documents that you're going to need to submit to various institutions on an annual basis. Okay, so this is kind of true with any company. There are annual filings you need to make. So with a nonprofit that's based in Massachusetts specifically, well, the first thing is the annual tax return you need to file with the IRS that Daryl mentioned earlier. That's the Form 990, and that's something that any nonprofit around the country has to do. With Massachusetts specifically, you need to file the Form PC, which is essentially a document each year that explains the activities you've been up to. You can update, your list of directors and officers, explain the money you've had come in. So it's kind of just like an update to the Attorney General saying, this is what we've been up to the last year. And then you separately also submit an annual report to the Secretary of Commonwealth, which is a much lower burden. It's a smaller document, just kind of a checking in, telling them you're still alive. So these are just some of the registration documents you need to kind of keep up to maintain your nonprofit. And so we just want to give you an overall sense of cost here for all of the, for the formation and then your ongoing annual fees. So in Massachusetts, it's just $35 to submit the articles of organization and form that nonprofit. And then to submit the Form 1023, it's anywhere from $275 to $600, depending on whether you're forming the 1023 or using the 1023 Easy or the full 1023. And then registration with the AG's office is $100. So you're talking here at most still under $1,000. But then, maybe you're also paying for an accountant to help you with the full 1023. As Daryl mentioned, that's a pretty helpful thing. And then on the ongoing fees, so the annual report for the Secretary of the Commonwealth, it's really, only $15. The Form 990, which you're filing with the IRS, that can be anywhere from $0 to $190, depending on how much money you've made that year. And the Form PC, that annual update to the Massachusetts Attorney General's office, all the activities you've been up to, that is also the amount you spent that it costs for you depends on how much money you've had come in. So, if you're a nonprofit that hasn't brought in much money, you're going to be up down at the $35 level. But if you become a really successful, massive nonprofit, it could get up to $2,000. And again, those annual fees, you're probably going to want to have an accountant that works with you to make sure that your books are in order. Again, it's really important because you've got money coming in from donors and you're tax exempt, but you still need to tell the IRS the money you have coming in. And I'll turn it back over to Daryl now.
All right, so we're getting to the home stretch. Just a couple more topics, everyone. So this topic, we just want to talk about employment. So as your nonprofit grows, or as you're considering how do I structure and think about compensation, we just want to hit on a couple points. One of the first points is that you're not legally required to pay board members. This is a question that I think many nonprofits, bounce back and forth in debate. Is how do we assess, or identify the things that we do for our board, people who contribute a lot, but you're not legally required to. And there's considerations about why you may or may not want to pay board members. And some of that is like how that might look to the public and thinking about the private benefit and private annulment limitations. But when it comes to staff, is you should pay staff according to state law. The staff is, the people who are operating on the day-to-day basis, like your executive director, or, if you have fundraising people or people who are running your programs, they are acting in an employee role, different than the board that is acting in that oversight capacity. So you'll want to make sure that staff is paid accordingly to state law. So when you're thinking about compensation rules, right? So because again, we're thinking about this is operating for the public benefit. We don't want to see, the public doesn't want to see, people getting paid these crazy salaries. So for compensation, it really should be no more than fair and reasonable compensation for services rendered. Ways to look at that is to, identify what similar organizations are paying, what similar roles pay in both the for-profit and nonprofit environments, and then base it on a person's experience, education, and other qualities. And also, when you're making these salary decisions, also taking into consideration your conflict of interest policy to making sure that people whose salaries you may be voting on aren't involved in the decision-making process, so that again, it's fair and they're not placing any undue influence on that. And this is important because it's good policy and it's helps us make sure the nonprofit is working towards the public good. But it's also good because you'll have to report this information at the state level or at the federal level via the documents that you see on the right of the screen. So it's not like you can kind of just hide this or go about it willy-nilly. You'll have to show government agencies what you're doing. So it's important to do it the correct way. And then the next slide is volunteers. So thinking about volunteers, I think it's important that volunteers are essential to nonprofits, right? You have many people who are going to come work for your organization, and they'll provide some kind of service, but they may not provide it on a regular basis. It's important to note that not everyone can be considered a volunteer. If someone is working full time, so 40 hours a week for a nonprofit, they're likely an employee. If they're doing tasks that are viewed as like regular business tasks. So like the nature, so the things that you're going to want to consider about nonprofit or about volunteers is what is the nature of the entity receiving the services? Whether the activity is less than full-time occupation, whether regular employees are going to be displaced by the volunteer. So is the volunteer volunteering and helping with like some of the programmatic things, or is a volunteer doing things on the back end that you would normally hire an employee to do? So there's a bunch of things that you're going to want to consider when it comes to bringing in volunteers. But the key is going to be that you want to make sure that your volunteers are acting like volunteers and not acting like employees. And then further, you're going to want to have policies that state this, right? So a volunteer agreement that lays out what is the role and expectation of a volunteer. As part of this agreement, you'll want to consider that even if they're a volunteer, they might be providing some benefit, long-term benefit to a nonprofit. Like maybe they're creating some kind of intellectual property. So like they're writing a memo, or maybe in some nonprofits, they might be doing some coding work. So if they're doing things like that, then you may want to have as part of your volunteer agreement a provision that states that any intellectual property created by the volunteer belongs to the nonprofit, just so that you have that all wrapped up nice and neat, and there's no future disagreements that might hinder the nonprofit. Also, you're going to want to have a conduct policy, again, setting expectations for the volunteer so they know what to expect, and so that you know what to expect from them. And then I'll turn it back over to Sam for our last topic before we open up for questions.
Okay, so we've made it to dissolution. And if you're going to form a nonprofit, or if you have, hopefully this isn't something you'll be worrying about for a while, or if you're doing it, it's because you've completed your mission. But if you do want to wind down your nonprofit, there's a few things we want you to be aware of. So first of all, if you have assets, so you've got money or actual property, whether it's physical, tangible property, hardware or something, or if you've got intellectual property, so like intangible property, you do need to dispose of it. And you can't just kind of take it with you. Because it was part of the nonprofit, it kind of needs to stay in the charitable stream. So first of all, your articles of organization, which has some rules in it, there may be, or the bylaws, there may be some explanation of what should happen to assets upon winding down. And if you come to the clinic, we'll help you think about that when you actually form the nonprofit, and we'll help you think about, what would you want to happen to assets if you do wind down. And whatever does happen to those assets, they must go toward a charitable purpose. So maybe a common thing is to distribute the assets to other nonprofits. That's probably one of the most common ways. So point is, whatever the property the nonprofit owns, it continues to be in some sort of charitable purpose. In terms of the actual process of winding down, so in Massachusetts, and in a lot of states, a court petition is actually required to wind down and close up the nonprofit. And so we've actually done this for a number of our clients before. And basically what happens is you go to the court and you say, hey, we need to wind down. And the judge will say, either, okay, I've seen enough information about, the status of your assets, and you're officially allowed to wind down. Or the judge may say, hey, you've been involved in the community, and I want you to, publish a advertisement essentially in some local newspaper, pointing out that you're going to be winding down. And then you have to go back to court a couple weeks later to show that you've done that. We've had that happen as well. So the point is, there may be some sort of requirement to communicate to the public about the winding down of the nonprofit. There's processes in place to kind of administratively force the nonprofit to wind down if you've kind of forgotten about it, which sometimes happens. But we don't recommend that. It's good with a nonprofit to make sure you are following the rules to wind it down, because again, these are, entities that the public and community trusts. And if there's no one behind it, then it should be properly wound down. So that's the end of our content here. Before we open up to questions, just a reminder that, well, here's the link to our site. And frankly, you can also just Google BU Startup Law Clinic, and it'll get you to our site. And we have more information on that site about our services. There's a lot of really helpful resources. There's a resources tab where you can see our prior presentations, and we'll put this one up there soon. We also have some white papers. And you can also sign up to meet with us if you are eligible for our clinic and you want to learn more about a startup, a nonprofit, or what have you. So with that, we're happy to take any questions you may have.